Once upon a time, there was a Chinese farmer whose horse ran away. That evening, all of his neighbors came around to commiserate. They said, "We are so sorry to hear that your horse has run away. This is most unfortunate." The farmer said, "Maybe." The next day, the horse came back bringing 7 wild horses with it. And the evening, everybody came back and said, "Oh, isn't that lucky? What a great turn of events. You now have 8 horses." The farmer again said, "Maybe." The following day, his son tried to break one of the horses in while riding it. He was thrown off and broke his leg. The neighbors then said, "Oh dear, that's too bad." And the farmer responded, "Maybe." The next day, the conscription officers came around to conscript people into the army, and they rejected his son because he had a broken leg. Again, all the neighbors came around and said, "Isn't that great?" Again, he said, "Maybe." In life, certain things happen to us, whether big or small, and sometimes we don't see how great of an impact they have within the story of our lives until some time has passed. We can often look at moments in our life and not realize the weight they have or where they can lead. In the moment, we can be upset about our son breaking his leg on a horse, and the next day be happy that it saved him from being drafted into a war. We ask ourselves these questions when we look back on our lives and say, well, maybe I was meant to be there so I could end up here. Or we look back on what we had missed out on. Maybe I was supposed to go that direction and I didn't, and that's why I ended up here. It reminds me of 2 stories. One, I was at the Boston Park, and this just came to me, so I'm getting my memory flooded back to me. But I was at the Boston Park, and I was walking around, and we were staying at a hotel nearby, and my dad said, "All right, do you guys want to keep hanging out at this park? It's a beautiful park. If you haven't been there, it's definitely a park you want to go to." He's like, "We can keep hanging out, or we can go back to the hotel." And I remember thinking, something told me I should stay. And I was like, "No, it's okay. Let's go back to the hotel." I didn't realize the importance of what was happening at the Boston Park as soon as we drove away until the next morning. I look back, I wake up, I see the news, Justin Bieber hanging out with fans at the Boston Park. And I was like, I love Justin Bieber. I want to hang out with Justin Bieber at the Boston Park. I was like, why did I tell Dad? Yeah, let's go. And it was at the same minute he was there that we drove away. Another story that I have that comes to mind is I was offered a manager position here in town, and I was so excited about the job. I felt like I should take this job. I should take this opportunity. This is like such a great job. I'm so excited, but something deep down within me said, don't take the job. Don't take the job. And then I started noticing some red flags popping up, right? Now, at this time, I was working at Trader Joe's, and so I declined that manager position here in town. And I'm working at Trader Joe's, and it was supposed to be my first day at that new job. And I'm like, well, who knows? Maybe I'm supposed to be here today. And then I met Vanessa, who became my best friend and is now my girlfriend. And so, yeah, it's awesome. You can share it. So, 2 examples of where I wanted to do something, and I was like, nah, I'm just going to go back to the hotel. And I had missed out on something so awesome. Another example to where I followed my instincts, and I was like, I feel like something's telling me not to take that job. And there was, of course, much prayer and counsel and advice from multiple people. And Bob, Michelle, Andrew, wisdom, thank you. And then on that first day, I had no idea that I'd be meeting my best friend. Life has these moments. In this chapter, Queen Esther doesn't fully realize why she has been made queen, but she is given the opportunity for a maybe. In last week's sermon, Andrew went over Act 2 in the story of Esther, which for Esther, she got not just a surprise, but a huge shock to her whole life. We hear about the conspiracy against the king, a king with a new wife, an orphan girl who rises to a place of prominence, and stories that leave your friends who love gossip intrigued. We have been introduced to 3 of the main characters so far. King Xerxes, the thoughtless fool acting on any whim. Queen Esther, the once unnoticed orphan who is hiding her true identity and living a life as a Persian rather than as a Jew. And Mordecai, Esther's cousin slash uncle slash father figure slash Yoda mentor. And we love Mordecai. This week in Act 3, we are introduced to a new main character. His name is Haman. You know the characters in movies or TV shows where you just can't help but hate them? You ask every time they come on the scene, why are you the way that you are? I think about Angela from Stranger Things Season 4. Do you guys remember her? She was bullying Eleven. My goodness. The roller rink. Dolores Umbridge in Harry Potter. The worst teacher of all time. Or Johnny Lawrence from the original Karate Kid, right? We all know those characters in the series and the movies to where we just can't stand them. Well, ladies and gentlemen, meet Haman. You're going to hate everything he chooses to be. Esther chapter 3, starting in verse 1, it says, "After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman. For the king had commanded this concerning him, but Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, 'Why do you disobey the king's command?' Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated. For he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai could not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. So this man named Haman is given second in command to the king. The author ascribes him to the people of the Amalekites by calling him an Agagite. He was important enough that the king gave a command for all the people working for the king to bow and show him respect. But our guy Mordecai does not. So people who worked with Mordecai one day were like, "Hey, how come you don't bow to Haman? You're breaking the king's command." And the next day, they're like, "Mordecai, you're breaking the king's command. Come on, what's your reasoning?" But Mordecai doesn't do it. He doesn't comply. He won't. We see the questioning from the other royal officials because they know not to disobey a king's command, but maybe they are more shocked at Mordecai's lack of respect because they know Haman. Haman demands his respect, and as we get to know this character, we also will soon see that his ego is fragile. For some, it doesn't matter how many compliments are surrounding you. If one thing negative is said, it can become all you think about. For Haman, it became his goal to fix the issue with the disrespectful Jew. So these royal officials go and speak on Mordecai to Haman, which is like a little frustrating. It appears to me that the authors are writing that Haman hadn't noticed. It's not entirely clear. They were like, "Hey, look, Haman isn't bowing to you. Are you like okay with that? Was there some sort of agreement?" And when we talk to him, he just says, "I'm a Jew." But the reason why Mordecai doesn't bow is unclear. The author doesn't really invite us into that. There are a few possibilities that we can decipher through the text. One being it's because Mordecai is jealous of Haman. He, after all, saved the king, like we learned last week, and did not get recognized. Yet Haman has gotten recognized for his works, and he got promoted to second command. This view is possible, but it would be unfair to give Mordecai this motive when the author doesn't show us his feelings, his thoughts, or the reasons he doesn't bow. Another possible reason, which is very popular taught from when I was growing up, is that Mordecai is basically saying, I only worship God and I will not worship you. But the only problem with that is the law isn't asking for worship, but respect. So Mordecai isn't being this religious, uncompromising hero. The third motive for Mordecai, which is the most likely motive behind him not bowing, is that of Haman's heritage. A Jew would not want to respect a man, bow to a man, who comes from a lineage of people who oppressed the Jewish people. They are tribal enemies. A Jew during these days would view that as not respecting oneself and not respecting their own heritage of Jewish descent. So, now we don't get too far into it, but there is a huge history between the Jews and the Agagites, also known as the Amalekites. You can learn more about their tension with each other in Exodus 17, Deuteronomy 25, and 1 Samuel 15, if you want to write those down for later. Exodus 17, Deuteronomy 25, and 1 Samuel 15. For now, we're just getting to the point that they are enemies. The Jews view the Agagites, the Amalekites, as oppressors who should be dead and gone away with. So how do we see Haman responding to the fact that this Jew will not bow to him? He becomes enraged, it says. So fun little Jewish literature storytelling. Authors often use names for characters to tell you how they will be in their story, so that the reader would know what type of person they are reading about, rather than sometimes giving the name to the exact person they are reading about. Not always, but sometimes. I believe we see that here with Haman. The writer plays with his name to sound like the Hebrew word wrath, which is Hemah. So Hemah, Haman, very similar wordplay there to just show you the type of character that he is, right? The man that's always Hemah, wrathful, he will be. Can you say that? Hemah. Good job. Wow. Jesus. The author definitely wants the Jewish leaders to not like him. So how does Haman, the man filled with fury, with wrath and rage, decide on how to respond to his hurt ego and pride? In verse 6 of chapter 3, yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. He's like, I can't just be satisfied by punishing Mordecai. I'm going to kill every Jew in this entire kingdom. Haman, I think this is a much bigger deal than what you're making it. Let's think of something far worse. I'm being very sarcastic. This is an overreaction. It's like, Haman, you don't seem upset at all. Wow, you're taking this well. Michael Fox said this, what is revealed in all of this is a vast and tender ego. Haman's primary motivation in all his actions is neither racial hatred, though he hardly lacks this, nor an undirected spleen, though he is certainly splenetic, but rather the need to confirm his power at every step. Now, I don't think anyone here is planning revenge on a whole race of people due to one person who's rude to you at work. But if we're honest, there are moments when our pride is hurt. We think to ourselves, do they know who I am? How dare they? Do they know who they are? Or we can think of the time when we said, they don't deserve my respect. As followers of Jesus, neither of these options are a posture that we want to live in. This is not humility. When I see Haman or even Mordecai, I cringe at the foolishness in my own heart, the moments where I had demanded respect when I wouldn't give it because I felt they didn't deserve it. I hope that when we come to read these stories of these characters, we walk away with a little bit more wisdom and learning from their foolishness. David Guzik said this, Haman could only consider himself a success if everyone else thought he was a success. Going back to the scripture, verse 7, in the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and a month. And the lot fell in the 12th month and the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, there is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all of the provinces of your kingdom, who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. So, let's go through this text and see what's happening. So Haman is casting a pur or lots, which inspires the name for the holiday of what this book is about. And we'll learn more about that in the coming weeks. For now, we see Haman having a diviner or a fortune teller or a soothsayer, etc., cast these dice to decide on how he should act on his revenge against, when he should act on his revenge against Mordecai. So in these days, it was common for religious people to throw these lots or these dice to see on how they would decide to do things or when they would do them. We see this done by the Jews throughout Scripture, asking God for answers. The dice in those days would have a word or an image or numbers similar to what we have today, sometimes all three. The Jews would ask something like, if you want us to go to Africa, have the dice land on a 3. If not, have it land on the image, whatever it may have been. Others used it with their own gods. It wasn't just the Jews who did this, but many cultures. They did it for magic, but some often left their decisions up to chance. It's interesting to note that Haman would leave this to mere chance or to a fortune teller. He doesn't give the impression he is asking for a god for advice, but rather tripping over his own ego, saying Mordecai's people will die and there's nothing he can do about it. Let's just by chance see what day it falls on. Simply in this very small verse, we see Haman's character and who he is. Joyce G. Baldwin said this: Haman takes for granted his own ability to engineer events and bring about his hostile intentions. He believes he can control history within the limits of his circumstances. But take note for later that it lands in the last month of the year. Next, we see Haman use part of the truth and a complete lie against the Jewish people to manipulate King Xerxes into giving Haman his signet ring to bring this law into an effect. He would give over his ring, they would stamp it, and he was like, now that's a law, and it would stay in place. The law wouldn't be able to be revoked, removed, or changed. The part truth that Haman goes to the king with is that these people are scattered across the Persian Empire, and they have their own lives, which they did, and they were scattered people. But he lies in saying that they did not obey the king's laws. The law that Haman has asked the king to publish, to decree, is that anyone for any reason can and is commanded to kill their Jewish neighbors, coming into an effect at the end of the year. Now, Haman doesn't tell Xerxes which group of people he is even targeting with the laws, and Xerxes doesn't even ask. Michael Fox points this out from verse 8. Echad, a certain people, can also be translated one people. Haman chooses a phraseology that insinuates your empire embraces many peoples. One of them, just no big deal, is peculiar and dangerous, and you shouldn't tolerate them. He words it to mean, don't worry about who they are, it's just no big deal, but take care of it, show your power. And Xerxes, no questions asked, quite frankly, because he is so self-absorbed with his power, he goes through with Haman's demand. Remember, Andrew talked about this last week. His thoughtlessness and carelessness was so dangerous that it was utter chaos. Haman takes advantage of the king's foolishness to give his revenge. A law which cannot be revoked has been signed. Once a person law, it's in. That's it. Haman has won. The law posted, and everyone in the land of Persia knows now what the fate of these Jews are. But in Susa, where the Jews were primarily, there is bewilderment, shock, and confusion. Neighbors seeing their friends with bounties on their heads, and Jews seeing they are once again being hunted. Haman and King Xerxes then begin to celebrate his rule and their power, celebrating the fact that they are able to just do this. Xerxes not even asking questions. Xerxes not caring. While King Xerxes doesn't even know what he's doing, Haman is bloodthirsty for revenge. Now, this law doesn't even give reason of why the Jews can be targeted. Michael Fox also said this: Haman's edict in scene 3 presumes that a great many people are waiting for the opportunity to destroy the Jews, and need only be unleashed. The edict need not convince them to set to the task or explain why the Jews should be destroyed. In this, we have a hint that the conflict is not between two men alone, or even two people within an empire, but between the Jews and the masses of people throughout the empire. Danger on a mass scale is always a reality for the Jews, but until a demagogue gives the hostility free rein, it stays fairly well in the background. Haman's motive was revenge against Mordecai, but he used anti-Semitism and a king's ignorance to build his revenge. So now the story takes us to Act 4, Chapter 4, to check in on Mordecai. It's intense, I know. When Mordecai learned of all that he had done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. And in every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So when Mordecai reads what is going to come to pass, he publicly and loudly mourns, as a form of protest that he is bitterly against this new decree and is in deep sorrow for the obvious reason. So during this time, Mordecai is allowed to mourn and protest, but not where he can communicate with Esther freely and easily. Next, I think it's important to notice that the text says the Jews fasted, but it does not make mention of Mordecai fasting himself. Here he mourns and yet does not cry out to God, but cries out to the people, again as a form of protest. Mordecai, although he has wisdom and faith in God, he isn't shown to be the example of what the reader should be, but I think rather someone the reader can relate to. In verse 4, when Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in the front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain to her, and he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. So let's go over this. So because Mordecai cannot return to work within the king's gates because he's covered in sackcloth and ashes, right? Esther doesn't know why he is mourning. They aren't speaking. It's also possible she had most likely not heard yet about the Jewish punishment. If she had, then maybe she would understand the severity of it all. So Esther, wanting to speak with him, sends him clothes so he can enter into the gates and she can hear what is going on. But Mordecai refuses. She doesn't understand that Mordecai isn't entering the king's gates because it's not because he doesn't have any other clothes, but rather the reason is he is mourning, and the mourning is worthy of staying in sackcloth and ashes for good. Mordecai sees the last day of his life and his people ahead and says, I will die mourning rather than clothe myself as if nothing is happening. So Esther is like, okay, fine. She sends her servant Hathach, which is one of the king's eunuchs. So Mordecai explains to Hathach everything and sends him back to Esther, giving a command. Go to the king and beg for mercy and plead with him for your people. In verse 9, Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned to the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. So Esther argues with Mordecai about this point for a fair reason, right? The king had a law that no one can enter his courtroom unless invited, and if they dare do so, they would die, unless he's feeling kind that day. But Esther explains the king hasn't invited her to see him for 30 days. The threat is high. The advice given from Mordecai is reckless, dangerous, and to Esther, she sees the odds are stacked against her. In verse 12, it says, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. So Mordecai responds one last time. It's one of the most famous verses in the Bible and definitely the most famous verse of this book. Mordecai responds, don't believe for a second that you will walk away from this alive just because you live with the king. But if you stay silent, you will die. Rescue will come from somewhere else, but you will die. Now, there are some different opinions about why Mordecai is explaining to Esther that she'll die either way if she didn't speak up, but the answer is not clear and not stated. What is clear is Mordecai's faith. Contrary to Haman, who leaves things to mere chance, Mordecai trusts that God will rescue his people somehow, but Esther has a decision on if she wants to be a part of it. When the time comes and God wants to do something, will we find ourselves willing to be a part of it? This next part, listen closely. Mordecai says, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Who knows? Perhaps this is the reason you are here. Church, the coolest thing that we can learn from the book of Esther is what if? Maybe. Perhaps. It's a maybe. You were born and you are here at your job with your family, fill in the blank, for such a time as this. Perhaps, who knows, what if, maybe God has you where you are for a reason. Perhaps the opportunities you have been waiting for have already been made aware, but you're waiting for a big sign rather than just the opportunity itself. Who knows, maybe the relationship you have dreamed of since you were young is one date away, or the spouse already with you at home. What if instead of looking for someone to lead, to love on, to become friends with, you see where you are with the relationships in your life already? And maybe, just maybe, you haven't made the best decisions in your life, but where you are right now can lead to the best decisions of your life. When I didn't take that job, I had no idea I was going to be meeting my girlfriend the very day I was supposed to start working there at my old job. Life happens. There's a possibility. There's a maybe. We call this series the theology of possibility. The opportunities you are looking for are right in front of you. the person you aspire to be, the place you aspire to be, the people you want to love, lead, inspire are here with you now. This is the point of this book, that God has put you here and now, the perhaps of a lifetime, the just maybe that might hold the work of God within you for such a time as this. Now remember, when I said it's important to note that the dice landed on the last month, when Haman rolled the dice, the lots, and it landed in the last month, I said, remember that, it's important. That has God written all over it. It gave Mordecai and Esther as much time as they could get. In Haman's arrogance, leaving the destruction of the Jews to mere chance, God divinely plans the dice to land at the very end of the year. Remember, Mordecai and Esther are not speaking in person. They're speaking over a messenger who's going back and forth. Who knows how long that conversation took place? Who knows how long before Esther had made up her mind and sent back her reply to Mordecai? It could have been days, weeks, or months. God's name isn't mentioned once in this book, but his hand is seen through the writing of these pages. Maybe God is giving you the time to take the stand, see the people around you, and opportunities open up for you that you wouldn't pick. There's no big sign in the sky, but just a question. Hey, can you come serve this Sunday at the park? Hey, you want to come over for lunch? Hey, are you doing anything today? The possibility of what could happen when you stop to see the spot God has placed you. And it's not this big, clear, paved way, but who knows? Maybe this is why you're here. Esther gives her response to Mordecai. In verse 16, let's read. Go gather together all of the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Esther commands. She steps into a leadership role rather than a passive role like she has been for the last couple chapters, for the Jews and Mordecai to fast for her. Andrew had a series on fasting, so if you want to learn more about fasting, we have that on the podcast and you look back to it. But what fasting is that it's restricting yourself from food to draw yourself closer to the desires of God to see what his will is. And Esther commands all the Jewish people at one to fast for her during this time. Remember, Mordecai didn't fast earlier, but he carries out her instructions now. She is realizing who she must be. She has denied and kept her secret of her Jewish heritage for too long, but not any longer. She finally steps into who she really is, who she already was. She didn't change who she was. She finally accepted who she was. She is a Jew within the Persian Empire, and nothing will keep her now from standing to the king. She says, if I die, I die. Church, believe this, you are already the person God has called you to be. But there are moments where you will step in, where you'll step into that. You'll have opportunities arise where you say, maybe this is why I'm here, and if I die, I will die. Who knows? Maybe you're exactly what's needed to bring change into the people around you, into their situations in their life. The author writes with this inspiration that no matter where you come from or what you have done, and maybe you don't see it, but maybe, just maybe, this is the thread, the story that God has interwoven you in these situations for such a time as this. You are not the angry person you have been told you are. Maybe you have opportunities to surround with the people around you with kindness. You are not the father who will turn his back on his children, but rather, maybe, just maybe, you're the father who raises these children up and loves on them and inspires them and shows them what life is like. But you have to make that call like Esther. You may say, I've already gone too far. I've already screwed things up. I've messed up. Like Esther, she already denied her heritage for years. Who is she now to say that she's a Jew? Who is she to be used by God after all she has done? And we talked about last week, there was some not so good things happening. Who knows? Maybe she was the exact right person in spite of all that has happened. Who knows? I'd say perhaps in your situation with your faults and difficulties, you are too. I am too. Michael Fox says this, now hope has emerged, yet it resides rather uncertainly in a young lady whose life has hitherto been devoted to beauty treatments and the royal bed. So church, who knows, but maybe God is inviting you right now. I think of the stories of the scriptures and how, in the story of Esther in particular, how it invites us in. We see Esther, we see her flaws, we see that she is one foot in the culture, one foot trying to remember her Jewish heritage, or she's speaking with Mordecai. And she thinks like, this is just her life, this is just how things are going to happen. But maybe it was happening that way for a reason. Church, maybe the circumstance that you are in today, you're like, why is this happening? It may be causing stress. Or maybe you can look back into moments in your own life, like I had mentioned earlier, in your own life where you're like, I'm so glad it seemed bad in the moment, but once it happened, or once the future things came forth, I was like, oh my gosh, if we didn't get that oil change, we would have been in that accident, or whatever. You know, like, let your mind wander. Let you start thinking about the times in your life when possibility, and you don't know the answer. You don't know. So you say maybe. Maybe you don't see God. Like in the story of Esther, we don't see God's name here. We don't see what he's doing exactly. But on the outside, we can see how these circumstances are lining up. Church, listen closely. God will reveal himself to you through ordinary and daily life things. And you may not see it that day. But if you are awakened, if you are willing, if you are ready for that possibility, God can work through you. So church, who knows? But maybe God is inviting you right now to something. Right now, maybe he's inviting you to accept his call. It isn't flashy, and it may not be completely clear. God is going to do a work in Los Lunas with or without you, with or without me, with or without Andrew. God is working in Los Lunas, and this is a picture of it. This is the proof of it, right? But he wants to invite you. He wants to work with you. And maybe that's why you're here, whether it's your job, your family, your passions, whether you want to open up a business or you want to do art or whatever it may be, maybe it'll do something for the kingdom of God. I end with this call from Joel, which I believe the author of Esther is. They wrote this passage in such a way that it's a call to the other scripture. Joel 2:12-14. Even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. Rend your heart and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love, and he relents from sending calamity. And who knows? He may turn and relent and leave behind a blessing, grain offerings and drink offerings for the Lord your God. Church, at Zion City, we don't believe in just hearing the word and walking out. We practice, we believe in responding. So if you want to stand with me, please. I believe that God is calling us into these moments where we don't view life as mundane or small, because it isn't. The story that God has for you, the story that God has for Zion City, the story God has for me is interwoven into possibilities. We may not see it now, we may not even see it in our lifetime. But awaken your imagination. What is your passion? What is your heart's desire? What should you wait for? What should you ask for? What is God doing within you? What is your circumstance? Until some time has passed, we don't always see what God is doing, but we can look back and think, I'm so glad that God did that for me. I'm so glad I stepped into that moment. I'm so glad that I trusted that God was working in my heart, that God was calling me, and I listened. It may just feel like a little nudge. It may feel like this voice in your head, and you're not sure if it's you or if it's God. But maybe, just maybe, God is calling out to you. God is pulling you forth. And it might look like a job change. It might look like new opportunities. It might look like some healing in the relationship that you're in. But here, maybe, just maybe, that call that you're hearing, that call that you are getting to step forward and to act, maybe, just maybe, you were meant to be here for that moment. And it is you and only you that God can work through for that time. But we can miss out on it. God can have someone else. God's going to work, but he's inviting you. He wants you. We're going to have people up here to pray. If you need prayer, we'll be up here to pray with you. Amen. Thank you.